Uh, John, after that lesson about speaking kindly, and then after me talking about John so glowingly, he got up and called orange putrid. What in the world? And then proceeded to tell us Texas orange was something. Texas orange is brown. It's not even orange. At least in Boise, you have orange. You know, you mix it with blue. We tried to wear blue and orange yesterday to be all things to all people, but today we're just wearing orange. Even Oklahoma State, it's orange. And I don't know if Eric is still in here, but that's why I brought my own Yeti orange cup, because you never know what people are doing to the coffee cups in the hotel kitchen area. So anyway, whenever we think about today, we think about football. You know, the third Saturday in October, if you're from the South, you understand that's not just a date on the calendar. That's what we call one of the oldest and most storied rivalries in college football, Tennessee and Alabama. And traditionally, it was always played on the third Saturday in October. After they expanded with a couple more teams, they ended up, sometimes it was the third, sometimes it was the fourth, but that's what it's just called. It's the third Saturday. I've got a painting in my office that's entitled The Third Saturday in October. And when we think about the third Saturday in October, now Jeff's standing back there looking at me very, very closely to see what I'm going to say about all this, but when we think about the third Saturday in October, what we like to think about is 2022. When we were here with y'all, I've told Richard in 2022 I was here, we beat Alabama. Last year I wasn't here, Alabama beat us. Next year I'm coming back no matter what happens, you know, so invited or not. But we think about Tennessee kicking a field goal to win. When you mention this ball game, Tennessee, Alabama, we're going to talk about that big victory that we had in 2010. What an awesome game it was. We're probably not going to bring up that they beat us, I think it was 57 times before then. My boys couldn't remember the last time that we had beaten Alabama. Some of them weren't alive when we had last beaten Alabama. We remember the good things, though, don't we? If you don't believe that, then talk to some grandparents. Some of y'all have mentioned already having grandchildren and boys. We raised 3 boys, just like John. We're still in the process of one of them that's still at home. I'm not sure, those of you that have boys and girls, we have another mutual friend, Neil Pollard and Kathy, that John mentioned earlier. Kathy and his wife, Carla, have a podcast together. But they raised 3 boys, and one night after they had to carry one of their sons to the emergency room, Kathy couldn't wait to get home and call Melody and tell her that the difference in according to the emergency room doctor there, the difference in having boys and girls, he said, with boys, less drama, harder to keep alive. And it's true. I mean, I didn't know what it was like to raise girls. I knew that having 3 boys meant that there was a funk in that end of the house that, you know, teenage boys just produce an odor. I don't know what it is. And then we have now this summer, it's hard on an emotional daddy, but I've done 2 weddings for 2 of my sons that within 7 weeks of each other. They were trying to make my heart stop, I think, John. But anyway, but now I've got these 2 wonderful daughters. I told my boys if I knew daughters were like this, that's what I'd have had to begin with, you know. We had some stuff going on at the congregation, and I had an elders meeting one Wednesday night, and one of my daughter-in-laws texted me at 6 o'clock in the morning, because she knows I get up at 5:30 in the morning, texted me at 6 o'clock in the morning, I want you to know I love you and I'm praying for you. Isn't that sweet? Guess what my boys texted me? Nothing, you know. But when I talk about my boys, I don't usually talk about those bad things. When I talk about my wife, I don't usually talk about bad things either. I think Lori's going to get another double for me and Eric to stay in tonight at the La Quinta, by the way. I failed to tell you this morning with the whole root beer story that Melody can't smell. So that's good for me and the boys that she can't smell. But we talk about the good things usually, right? That's what we want to focus on, is the good. But the reality is that there's some bad that happens, isn't there? Isn't that true in our spiritual lives? We've talked about that a couple of times today already. is that when we focus on, when people get up and when you go to a lectureship like this, as a minister, people get up and they'll say glowing things about you. They'll talk about where you went to school and what you graduated with and all the years you've been in ministry and the books you've written and the podcasts you're on and the works you're involved with. I've never had anyone get up and say, you know, Corey sometimes is not a really good husband. Corey sometimes has really failed as a daddy. There's been times in ministry that Corey has really dropped the ball. But the reality is, that's Corey. Now, I don't know how many ministers that earn your living through the gospel are in this room today. If you are, would you raise your hand? Several. If you're a minister, raise your hand. All the rest of you's hands should go up right now. Because we all should have a ministry. In the book of 2 Corinthians, if you'll turn over there with me to chapter 12, 2 Corinthians is maybe the most personal, emotional letters that Paul writes. And Paul is talking about in this book about the struggles that he's had to face and has to defend himself, and he's having to deal with some of the problems that he... And Paul was, as Eric pointed out, Paul was never hesitant to be real about who he was and what his past was. Sometimes we don't have that. I'm going to talk about Paul because that's the text assigned to me. I'm also going to use evidently Eric and I both use Canva, I guess. But anyway, the same slide here for this one at least. But just like Paul, we need to recognize that there's times that we struggle and there's times that we fail. And there's a balance that we have to have here. I went to a lectureship one time, and there was a guy that was speaking about how to overcome burnout in ministry. And I went to the lecture, and after it was over, the guy sitting next to me said, "What'd you think?" And I said, "Well, I never really wanted to quit ministry until I heard him preach about ministry." And then, sometimes we can, as preachers, bemoan all the things that we've gone through and the crosses that we've had to bear, and really feel sorry for ourselves. But I don't want to leave that impression with you. But I do want to recognize, and all the guys here that are in full-time ministry, and all of you that are involved in the various ministries you're involved in, you know that there's struggles, right? There's times when it's hard and when it's tough. And I mentioned this morning about those, you hear it sometimes called the Monday blues with a preacher. With me, sometimes it's the Sunday night blues, because I start rehashing all the things that I wish I'd have said. I wish I hadn't told that root beer story about Melody, or I wish I hadn't have said this in that way, or I wish I'd remember to bring up that passage or make this point or whatever. And I can only see the things that I did wrong because I see me as I am, flawed. And I am more critical of myself than anyone else can be. And yet at the same time, whenever we do anything, there's always those that are going to be critics. There's always those that are going to try to put us down or try to say you should have done it this way or whatever it might be. To understand the struggles that are real in ministry, sometimes because of what others have done, sometimes because of the world we live in, sometimes because of the things that we try to put on ourselves. And it's a reminder of maybe another area of grace that we need to have, of God's grace and understanding and accepting God's grace even in ministry for ourselves. In 2 Corinthians chapter 12 and verse 9 is a section of text where Paul talks about this thorn in the flesh that he has. And the title that was assigned to me is Sufficient Grace. And that's what we see in this very text. In chapter 12 and verse 9 of 2 Corinthians, the first part of that verse, talking about this thorn in the flesh, he said that after he had prayed about it, God said to Paul, "My grace is sufficient for you." My grace is sufficient for you. How many of you have read that verse before? How many of you believe that verse is true? How many of you, it's hard to accept that verse? I can know it academically, I can know it mentally, but accepting it is sometimes so hard for us to do. And in a variety of ways. We're going to maybe focus kind of the attention where the context is here. But in forgiving myself for sins I've committed, we hold on to that guilt way longer than we should. In comparing ourselves to each other, and the Bible says that when we do that, we're not wise, because we all have different talents and we're all important parts of the body. 1 Corinthians chapter 12, Romans chapter 12. But the grace to accept that God's grace is sufficient, that it's enough. That's what that word means, is that it's enough. Maybe you've seen this Geico commercial where the waiter comes over and says, you want some Parmesan cheese on your Italian dish? And he says, yes. And he says, say when. Say when. And the guy just sits there. And so I tried to be funny last night at the Italian restaurant, and I start sprinkling some cheese on, and I told Melody, say when. And she said, when. You know. Because, you know, in the commercial, he just keeps letting it pile up. This is how you know that this is not an accurate depiction, because, see the wife here? She's smiling. No way would the wife be smiling at that point. Eric, she'd be way past grace at that point, you know. Finally, it's enough. And that's the way I feel like I need grace. Just keep piling it on, because I see all the flaws. And I see all the mistakes, and I see all the hardships, and I see all the failings. Just keep on coming. It's never enough for me to say, I've had enough, because I need more. I don't remember now who it was that said yesterday, when do you get to the point where you're saying, all right, that's enough lessons? I think maybe it was Eric. When do you get to the point where you say that it's enough lessons about grace? Well, you don't, because we realize how much that I need it. See? But I'm also reminded of the movie Babe. Have you seen that one? You remember at the very end of the movie, when he looks down at the pig and he says, that'll do, pig. That'll do. That word that's translated sufficient, that's really what it means. Is that's enough. That'll do. And the Lord looks down at Paul and he says, that'll do, Paul. My grace, that'll do. And the Lord's looking down at us and saying, you don't have to do it all on your own. You don't have to be perfect. You don't have to figure it all out. That'll do. My grace, that'll do. And so this afternoon, we're going to talk about that God's grace is enough. God's grace is enough. And especially in the context of what Paul's dealing with here in 2 Corinthians 12, we're going to focus that in our ministries. I want you, ministers and members that are involved in the various ministries that you're involved in, to recognize that God's grace is enough. And I'm so very thankful for that, as hard as it is for me to accept it. Let's go through the text, though, and notice 4 things about this section of Scripture. First of all, the description. This thorn in the flesh that Paul has. And there's lots of debate about what it is. Some think that maybe it was an eyesight problem. Some think that maybe it was a speech impediment back over in chapter 10 and verse 10, would maybe kind of indicate that maybe he had some sort of speech problem or a problem public speaking in some way. Maybe it was that it was something that Paul was dealing with more on a personal level. It's hard to know exactly what it is, and it doesn't really matter. We'll talk about in just a minute what the context kind of, I think, maybe leans towards a little bit. But since we don't know, we need to give each other some grace when we're talking about this particular issue. But whatever it was, there's a description of it given, a twofold description of what this thorn in the flesh is. And that word translated thorn could be a splinter or a thorn or any kind of foreign object that would irritate once it's within you. He calls it a thorn. That idea of something that's not, I've never seen anyone go out working fencing or working with lumber or whatever and say, I really hope I get a splinter today. Wouldn't that be nice? We don't want that. No one has ever said, this Valentine's Day, I hope I get a dozen thorns from my sweetheart. We don't want that, because once it gets in us, it's an irritant. It's something that bothers us. It's something that hurts us. If left unattended, it festers and it becomes infected, and it can cause some even real problems. And depending on where it is, it could be some very serious problems. Whatever this is, eyesight or speech impediment or some sort of persecution he's going through, whatever it is that Paul's dealing with, this is not a good description of it when he calls it a thorn. And it's a metaphoric description, of course, but that's the idea behind it, is this is something that's really hurting me. This is something that in my mind at least is not supposed to be there. This is something that's bothering me. Have you ever had that little splinter in your finger that you tried to, maybe your pocket knife couldn't quite get to, and you think, well, I got to wait till I get home and get some tweezers or something, and it just bothers you all day long. This bothered him. Or maybe you've gone to the theater and you've eaten popcorn, you got that hole stuck in you. You know, it just bothers you. The other description of it is that it's a messenger of Satan. And so there's some that believe that maybe whatever it is that Paul's dealing with is actually some individual that Satan is using to get at Paul. And maybe that's the case. Again, we'll get down later into the context of what he's going to talk about. Maybe that's what it was. There's some that even think that maybe this is like when, Paul wrote to the church at Thessalonica that he wanted to come to them, but Satan had hindered him some way. Maybe it was even a demonic figure. Maybe Satan himself was using not just a human person, but maybe one of his angels, one of his messengers. Whatever it is, again, this is something that's troubling Paul. And because of it, he feels like it's hindering the job that he's been given to him. The grace, as he would call it, there's another way that grace is used in Paul's writings, especially as a gift by God. That we would call it a talent or an ability because we're not as comfortable sometimes calling it a grace. But that's what Paul called it in Ephesians chapter 4 and 1 Corinthians 12 and Romans chapter 12 is the grace that God had given him to be an apostle, to be a minister, to carry the gospel to the Gentiles. Whatever this is, it's hindering him. It's keeping him from doing the job that he wanted to do. And Paul needed to understand that God's grace is enough. And so what was the purpose of it? Well, the purpose depends on whose perspective you're looking at it from. Because he tells us there was really kind of two purposes in it. First of all, he says it was to keep me from being conceited. And he says that twice. That would have been God, how God is using this. Now, he doesn't say that it came from God, but God will use, and we'll talk about this more later, but God will use negative things sometimes in our lives to produce good circumstances or good effects or good growth. Paul was in a position because of the grace given to him and the ability to be an apostle, to have revealed to him the mystery of God and to be able to go and preach and teach in all these different places that he had to become very conceited. One of the things as preachers that we have to watch out for is not to listen to our publicity sometimes when they get up and say, Brother so-and-so is such... And then when we walk out the door, everybody's going to shake your hand as the preacher. And what do they always say? Good sermon, good sermon. What's really bad is when you're the home preacher and the guest preacher is there, and hopefully this hadn't happened to you, Richard, this week, where somebody walks by you and shakes one of our hands and says, best sermon I ever heard. We don't get that kind of preaching anymore, But we hear that bragging. And sometimes it's that sweet little lady that always falls asleep in the pew, Best sermon I ever heard. I want to stop and say, what was your favorite part of it? But I give them grace, It's easy for us to become conceited. It's easy for us to think more highly of ourselves than we ought to. To think that we're the ones leading people to Jesus, that we're the ones causing the church to grow, that, preachers are often times like the quarterbacks. We get way too much credit when things are going well, and we get way too much blame sometimes when things are going bad. We got to watch that. So from God's perspective, he was using this in a way that would keep Paul humble. But secondly, he says it's to harass me. This word that's translated harass means more than just harass. I guess I harassed my wife with some of the stories that I told this morning, but I didn't do any damage to her, hopefully, not her reputation either. But this word, though, doesn't just mean to harass somebody or give someone a hard time. This word means to openly strike someone with a hand or a fist. It's the same word that Mark would use when he would talk about how that when Jesus was taken into custody and they're making fun of him and they're blindfolding him and asking him, prophesy, tell us who just hit you. Well, that hit you is this word. This is harmful and hurtful and painful and something that was intended to knock him down. That's Satan's perspective. Maybe the world's perspective. And Satan wants to knock us down. He wants us to stop having the ability to do the things that God wants us to do. He wants to try to discourage us or hurt us or stop us altogether, to totally ruin the church, its members, the work that God is doing through us. So the purpose maybe was intended to be bad, but God was using it for good. And that's an important concept to remember as I'm going through my ministry and I'm discouraged at all the troubles that I'm having or the struggles that I'm having or that person that's persecuting me or talking badly about me, trying to hurt my reputation or whatever it might be. Maybe even one day physical persecution might come on us here, even in the land of the free and the home of the brave. Can God use that for good? See, so many times we're so limited in our perspective of just what's right in front of us without thinking about how that God can help us to grow through those times. But then number 3, we think about God's grace is enough. Think about it from this context and the idea that Paul, his reaction to it. It's really a threefold reaction that he had to this. And it's a little bit maybe not what we would expect. The first one, certainly, but not the second two. First of all, Paul says 3 times that I pleaded with the Lord about this. That plead word is to beg, to entreat, to just think about the getting down on your knees and whatever it takes, please. I'm pleading with the Lord about this. And he's asking the Lord that it should leave me, that the Lord would help him get over this, that the Lord would take this out of his life, whatever barrier this is, if it's a speech impediment or if it's an eyesight problem or if it's someone persecuting him or if it's a satanic figure or some sort of demonic influence that's hurting his ministry. Whatever it is, Lord, please, I'm begging you to take this away. Have you ever been there in your ministry? Preachers, have you been there? Where there's something, maybe it's a sickness within your family, or maybe it's that member of the congregation that's just always a burr under your saddle. You know, they're always writing you about everything. Maybe it's that elder that you just can't do anything to please them. Maybe it's someone in the community that's trying to stir up some trouble. Whatever it is, you're just begging God, please take this away. Sometimes you get down on your knees and you fold your hands and you bow your head and you close your eyes, and I know that I need to pray, but I don't even know what it is to say. Have you been there? And you beg Him. And sometimes He doesn't answer the way we want Him to, does He? 3 times I begged Him. We're talking about the God of all grace, right? That's what I'm going to preach on tonight. The God of all grace. And I'm begging Him, not once, not twice, but how could God say no? I'm trying to serve Him. This is hindering me from serving Him. But you know what I forget sometimes is that He knows more than I do. And I see how it all should line up and how it all should work out. From my perspective, that is so limited. So his first reaction is begging God to take it away. Now understand, I'm not saying we shouldn't. God is the God of all grace. God's throne, He did name the throne of grace. He wants us. He's not a God that cannot be touched with the feelings of our infirmities. He wants us to bring our cares and our burdens and cast them down at His feet. Because He careth for you. That doesn't mean He's going to answer it the way that we want to. So pray. God wants you to pray. He wants you to turn to Him, but understand, there may be something bigger going on than Corey. Second reaction that Paul had is really remarkable. He said, therefore, because God didn't take it away, because God said, my grace is sufficient, my grace is enough, he said, therefore, because of that, I will boast all the more. What are you bragging on, Paul? I'm going to boast all the more gladly of my weaknesses so that the power of Christ may rest upon me. See, what Paul has understood is something that we need to understand, is those times when I have failings or weaknesses, that it allows God to shine. You go through the history of the Bible. We've looked at a lot of passages from Old Testament and New Testament throughout this week. And what you find over and over and over again is, as has already been said today, that God is the hero of the Bible. And how you see that is all these heroes of the faith that we have, they're not like the Justice League. This is not the Avengers of the faith. This is not some super team. These are a bunch of really flawed people, just like all of us are. David is one that, the man with God's own heart. And yet look at all the problems that David had within his own family. We think about guys like Moses and Noah and Peter and Paul, and sometimes we think about them as superhuman Christians, and I wish I could be like them. But what made Paul and Peter and David and Moses and Noah great is not how awesome they were, but how they allowed God to work through them despite their weaknesses. And while we'll never put on resumes, let's be honest, I'm not an eloquent speaker. Now, I had a young man come up to me, and I don't see him in here right now. I had a young man come up to me earlier and say, you sound like home, because he lives is from right across the Mississippi River from where we're from, He appreciated that. A lot of people don't necessarily appreciate the way that I talk. But it's the way I talk. Maybe I'm not the best at writing, or I'm not the best at one-on-one studies, or maybe I'm not the best at preaching a sermon or teaching a Bible class, but the power's not in Corey. Thank the Lord the power's not in Corey. The power's in the gospel of Christ. Romans 1, 16 and 17. Paul said, I'm ready to preach the gospel. Why? Because in it the righteousness of God is revealed. Why? Because it is the power of God unto salvation. Not how good a preacher I am. In fact, Paul's going to go right through and talk about the very opposite in 1 Corinthians. He's going to talk about, you're wanting to look at the wisdom of men. You're looking over at Athens and saying, look at how that they discuss things and debate things and how smart they are. And that's what you're putting all your stock in. We're just weak vessels. That's okay. Because I don't care if you've got a solid gold jug or if you've got that milk jug that you've rinsed out 14 times. If you put Melody sweet tea in it, it tastes just as good. Just as good. I'm going to boast in my weaknesses. Why? Because it allows the power of Christ to be seen. And people can understand my ministry is not going to be successful because of how perfectly that I preach the sermon, or how well that I write the bulletin article, or how efficient I am in sitting down and studying with people. And don't get me wrong, I'm a perfectionist. I make a lot of mistakes. I'm kind of a walking oxymoron, but I strive for perfection. I want to be better at all of the things that I do. But at the end of the day, I have to be able to give myself grace and realize that God's grace is enough. That the power's not in me. And thank the Lord and praise the Lord. We sometimes say it. I don't know how genuine, or even if we're really thinking about the meaning of it, when we say all praise to God or all glory to Jesus or whatever. By acknowledging our weaknesses, we're able to do that. But sometimes we're not willing to. The third reaction is he said, I'm going to be content. I'm content. Now I fully believe Paul would try to do a better job every time he would do something. He wants to give his best to the Lord and do as good a job as he can. But ultimately, I'm content because it's not about me. It's about Him. So that's kind of the context here in 2 Corinthians 12. But I want us to think about, just for a few minutes, when we think about God's grace being enough, I want us to think about what's the application of this. And maybe you've seen that sprinkled all in along. But here's what we want to do, and this is a very Western civilization way of thinking things. Well, I'm going to pull myself up by my bootstraps and look at what I'm going to accomplish and look at what we've done. And if we're not careful, we get to the end of the calendar year or the end of some sort of campaign that we're on or a lectureship, and we say, look at what we've done. We had X amount of baptisms. We baptized so many people. We restored so many people. We had this many people in attendance. We gave out that many meals. We did this and we did that and we did this and we did that. Where did you mess up? We don't want to talk about that. We don't want to talk about that I broke into a house when I was 7 years old. We don't want to talk about the time that I lied to my wife and hurt her feelings. We don't want to talk about the time that I overreacted and lost my temper with my boys and hurt their feelings. We don't want to talk about the time that I got too upset with somebody I was studying with and really made it into, I'm going to prove you wrong rather than try to help you see Jesus, and they walked away from the gospel because of me. The application is that it's not about us, it's about God. Notice what he talks about that he's going to boast in. In weaknesses and insults and hardships and persecutions and calamities, all of these kinds of things. Weaknesses is like physical ailments that he would have. Insults is obviously people hurling things at you verbally that are trying to hurt you or tear down your character. Hardships are things that like persecutions that I'm having to go through, that physical endangerment, problems that people are bringing on me. Persecutions are these organized programs to stop something or to halt something or to slow something down. Calamities comes from a word that just means really any kind of bad thing you have to go through. It could be something natural or something man-made, but all of these things, you list all of the things that Paul had to deal with. When he talks about being stoned and being beaten and being shipwrecked and being hungry and having people that were Jewish to try to persecute him and having people that were Gentile trying to persecute him and having people in the church even trying to persecute him. All the things that I went through, I don't want any of them, but I understand that it's not about me, it's about him. And Paul even struggled with that. But he talks about all these things. And after you made fun of my orange, I went back and changed yellow to orange on all of my I even checkerboarded this one, But look at in 2 Corinthians, all of the different places. We don't have time to go through all of them. If you're trying to take notes, you might want to take a picture because I'm fixing to move on really quickly. But all of these different times in 2 Corinthians alone, where Paul talks about the sufferings and the persecutions and the hardships and the problems that he faced. And he faced them. And maybe the thorn in the flesh wasn't one specific thing. Maybe it was, I know it's singular, maybe it was all of the things that people have brought on him. He's putting all in one bag and saying, this is all the things that I'm struggling with and dealing with and the hardships that I'm going through. But in 2 Corinthians, he also talks about something else. Because it's easy for us to look around and say, that brother that's causing me all these problems, that elder that's riding me all the time, that person that lives down the street that's making fun of me and calling me names, that guy at work that's making fun of me being a member of the Church of Christ, and y'all say this, and maybe they're not even being fair with what it is that we teach. All the things that because of my religion or my ministry or my service to the Lord, the problems that we have to go through just living in this life, the diagnosis, the sickness, the age that creeps up on us and pulls away our health and ability to do the things that we used to do or want to do. All of the things that we deal with. Paul says, I could stay focused on that, or I could see the bright side of things. I could recognize that God's grace is enough. Are these things bad? Yes. Do I want to go through them? No. But can I make them through by the grace of God? Absolutely. Because God's grace is enough. So Paul also talks about in 2 Corinthians his comfort and joy. He doesn't just talk about the bad times. He's balanced. He talks about in chapter 1, verses 3 through 11, about how that he gets comfort through God. In the old translations, it's consolation, but it's comfort, and how that God comforted me. And what that allows me to do is that the same things that God shows me, that gets me through those times, the comfort that God gives to me, I can extend to others and comfort them. That in chapter 4 and verse 1, he talks about, I take comfort and joy in the mercy of God. That He doesn't have to extend to me, that Eric just got through preaching about. Paul realized that as Saul of Tarsus, I was a bad boy. But God showed mercy to me when He did not have to. And I take comfort in that to realize that God wasn't looking for somebody perfect to begin with, or He never would have chose me. I take comfort and joy in the eternal glory that's waiting for me, that there's going to be a place that we get to go to that's so much better than this life in this world. Paul took comfort and joy in those encouragers in his life. Chapter 7, verses 6 through 13. We talked about that this morning, about how we can use our words to build up and encourage and give grace to others. Paul had those in his life, and he said it meant the world to him. He talks about the confidence that he had in his brethren, knowing where they were and what they were doing helped him. It helped him to feel better about their situation and the work that he was involved in. He talked about those that had like minds and what that meant to him. One of the things about these lectureships, you won't remember half of what I tell you, probably not near even that much. But you know what you will remember? You'll remember the hugs and handshakes out in that foyer. You'll remember the time you spent together, because being with people of like minds builds us up and encourages us, doesn't it? God's grace is enough. And I don't have to be perfect. Praise the Lord, I don't have to be perfect. I don't have to be the best preacher or the best Bible class teacher or the best elder or the best deacon or the best song leader or the best husband or the best wife. Sometimes people will say, well, how did you get your 3 boys to be interested in ministry? And I say, I don't know. We prayed a lot, you know. It wasn't because I was a perfect daddy. It wasn't because Melody was a perfect mama. I can promise you that. But we can do the best we can and trust in God's grace being enough. Sometimes those sufferings helps us to grow. You know, we talk about Job and Job's friends, and Job's friends came to the situation Job was in with the wrong theology. They thought that God always rewarded the righteous and He always punished the wicked. The problem was not only did Job have that theology, his friends have it, but Job had it as well. And Job struggled. And part of what he struggled with was he thought God had forgotten him. He thought for a while maybe there was some sort of, this is kind of the Corey Standard version here, but he thought that maybe there had been an accounting problem in heaven, and some sins got put in his account that wasn't supposed to be there, and that's why all this was happening to him. But as you follow the path of the 3 friends, you'll notice that there's this downward spiral. They start off saying, Job, we know you're a good man. We know you've done a lot of good things, but maybe there's something you need to consider. To by the end of their speeches saying all men are worthless and worms, and God just would wash His hands of us if He could. Job, however, keeps turning to God. The friends never do. But in almost every one of Job's speeches, at some point, he'll turn away from the friends and turn to God and pray. And you never see the 3 friends pray. But Job is praying to God. And over the course of his suffering, Job comes away with at least 3 really insightful ideas along the way. First of all, he recognizes that we all know that bad things happen to good people, good things happen to bad people. So God is just, we know that. There must be something beyond the grave in which God reconciles all accounts, since He's just. Now we would say, well, of course, but in Job's day and age, that wasn't something that was really that well put together. Job also got to the point, he said, I'd like to stand before God and plead my case. The problem is that God is so powerful and God is so awesome. Were I in His presence, I would probably say, yeah, God, you're right. I deserved all this when I know I didn't. You know what I really need? I need a redeemer or a mediator, someone who can stand equal with God and put His hand on His shoulder, and someone who knows what it's like to be a me and put His hand on my shoulder and negotiate between us. And we would say, well, of course, that's Jesus. But I'm not sure how much Job knew about Jesus, but he's recognizing the need for Him. A third thing that he comes to an understanding of is the positive quality of redemptive suffering. That is, Job was always a man who was very generous and helped out those in lesser conditions, but he recognized and realized as he went through suffering, he could empathize and sympathize with people a lot differently. You know, as we struggle, as we go through the problems and the situations that we have to in this life, sometimes it helps us to be actually better in our ministry. In 2015, we found out that Melody had melanoma. I'd heard of melanoma. I didn't know exactly what melanoma was. So I did what you should not do, and I looked it up online. And I found out what the survival rates of melanoma is. And it's scary. And they're talking about, you know, we're going to do this and we're going to do that, and the surgeries and all these things that we're going to do after the surgeries, and maybe she'll make it. And so we would tell our then little boys, Mama's going to be okay, and we'd send them to bed, and then Melody would start crying, and she would say, I know where I'm going, but I want to grow old with my husband and raise my children. And I would say, it's going to be okay, don't worry about it. Then she would go to bed, and I'd get on my knees, and I'd beg God, why are you doing this? But He did take us through it, and He answered our prayers the way we wanted. He didn't have to do that. I kept telling her it was going to be all right. When we found out it was all right, she said, you said it was, did you? I said, yeah, it was going to be all right. I just wasn't very specific on how it was going to be all right. But you know what I've done since then that I'd never done before? When someone in our church family has a diagnosis of cancer, I take their spouse or their caregiver aside and I say, look, there's going to be a time when you need someone to cry on or holler at or punch in the gut. Call me. You be strong. I've started ministering to the people who know people that have cancer, and I never did that before. But I didn't know how hard it was till I suffered through it. God's grace was enough. See, if we understand that and appreciate that, we can see things maybe from His perspective. Our world says, show only the good side. We don't post on Facebook, well, I just had a fight with Melody. She got mad at me about the root beer story today and threw a bottle at me, you know. We don't post that. We post the good things. We try to put this false front about how that everything's okay. And the problem with that is we're not being real, so how can we have real relationships? If we're not being real, how can we grow and mature? If we confess our faults one to another, it makes for accountability, doesn't it? If we tell people where we're struggling, whether it's sin or some other way, then it allows others that have been through those situations to minister to us and to help us. Me and my wife are struggling in our marriage, and some couple that's been married 50 years comes up and says, hey, we had the same struggles when we've been married about the same time. Let us help you and mentor you. But when we try to rely on what we can do, we're always going to end up flat on our face and not what we could be. If we just accept it, that God doesn't want to use the perfect, but to perfect those that He uses. And that's us if we'll allow Him. God wants to look at me, a stinky old ugly pig, that's probably not the best suited for the job that I have. And He wants me to look up at Him, and He wants to look down at me and say, that's enough. That's sufficient. That'll do, pig. That'll do. And whatever you're struggling with, whatever guilt you're carrying, God doesn't want you to carry that. He doesn't want you to see yourself as a dirty, worthless pig. He wants you to look Him in the eyes so He can tell you, that'll do. My grace, that'll do. Doesn't matter how far into sin you've sunk, He'll take you back. Doesn't matter how much that you've carried in the past, He'll bring you forward. If we learn to trust in His grace and realize His grace is enough, that'll do. My grace is sufficient, not only for Paul, but also for you. And in a world looking for hope, what beacons of light can we be when we start being real with people and saying, yes, I struggle, and yes, I've got failings, but I'm not standing on my own 2 feet. I'm standing on the shoulders of a Lord who loves me and who loves you, and who's willing to offer His grace to me and to you. Let's carry that message into the world around us. God's grace is enough.